it is a very coherent political and policy pitch grounded in evidence and pragmatism.
Yeah, I agree with
crafted
that.
by Michael Gove. But you're right, they didn't do anything. But that's not the same as saying there's no way to translate the pitch into politics.
I completely
policy.
agree.
It's that they just didn't do it because A, they got distracted, and B, because
of
the
chaos.
next lot are in fact not in favour of that stuff. They're still lost in this sense of because Boris Johnson's agenda
So what
fell.
are they in favour of?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
No, but I don't.
All the
asking the
many
wrong
things we
person.
could hold. Folks, this week we're asking how to deal with the ghosts of former leaders. Boris Johnson's back to haunt Rishi Sunak at the COVID inquiry. Keir Starmer is dreaming of Margaret Thatcher. How should a leader deal with their predecessors? Danny, if anything which reminds Rishi Sunak that he was part of Boris Johnson's team comes with a risk for him, doesn't it?
Yes. Look, I think he has not dealt with this issue. And it occurred to me when I was looking at the cabinet list that he's now got, which is, David Cameron, Jeremy Hunt, Alex Chalk, Victoria Atkins, Gillian Keegan. He has got a pretty centrist cabinet. He has therefore, in some ways, picked sides, and yet he hasn't. What is it that holds him back from picking sides? Well, it's refusal to deal with what's come before him. He will not say where he stands in relation to Boris Johnson's politics or Liz Truss's. It's actually a bit difficult because in order to do that, you have to kind of establish where it is you think that Boris Johnson did stand. Because in many ways, Boris Johnson was actually the most left-wing leader of the Conservative Party since Macmillan, and so you have a great deal of difficulty making that judgment. But my view is, if he was going to give a direction to the Conservative Party, he had to deal more clearly with what he thought about Boris Johnson on ethical issues, what he thought about Liz Truss, which he did, after all, say in the leadership election, on spending issues, and position himself to some extent by contrast with his predecessors. Otherwise, every time he sort of says, I'm going to make a change, against what? Against, he said 30 years, and then he appointed David Cameron. So against what is he making this change, and to what extent do we blame him for the policies that were implemented by the government he was a member of? Yeah. Does he distance himself from them or not? He hasn't made a choice about that for one reason or another, whether it's out of politeness or it's out of confusion, or I don't know what it is, but I think it's a mistake.
It should be quite simple for Sunak in a way, because what Johnson offered in 2019 was a mixture of sort of Brexity nationalism and high-spending socialism. I mean, he was a sort of national socialist in that sense. I mean, not in a Nazi sense, but he was a national. I mean, he was
Just to be clear.
Just to be clear, he was both nationalist and socialist. Now, both of those sort of are dead in the water. I mean, nobody is remotely interested in revisiting Brexit. We've been through our sort of nationalist stage. We've passed through our Brexit therapy, and we've come through the other side. Nobody wants to be dragged back to that. And we're in a deep fiscal hole, which means that socialism is not going to arrive anytime soon. So it shouldn't be hard for Sunak to set out a completely different sort of way forward and scheme of things. But unless he sort of removes himself, airlifts himself out of this sort of Johnson vortex, I just don't see how the public will view him as credible, viable, and somebody, who's born to lead. Perhaps it's just too big a problem in the Conservative Party. Perhaps they're just so divided and he doesn't want to reignite all those sort of tensions and spats and battles, and it's not an option for him. But it's certainly, to my mind, if he's going to stand any chance of winning the next election at all, hovering on zero probably, but if he's going to stand a chance, he's got to sever himself. He's got to separate himself from Johnson.
But I think we easily get confused because Boris Johnson is such a big character between his personal and kind of deficits or problems and whether his political pitch was right. Because as Peter says, and Danny says he's left-wing, I mean, left-wing, right-wing, it's a bit hard to pin him down, but there was that high-spending but sort of, and still quite socially liberal kind of agenda that Boris Johnson had. And that's not actually what brought him down with the voters. What brought him down was that he was involved in a whole bunch of parties and a whole bunch of scandals, which he didn't
lying,
manage to
rule breaking,
exactly.
chaos.
Yeah, some stuff like that, right? I didn't want him to be the Prime Minister. But nevertheless, he was brought down by character faults, not by the failure of his political pitch. And I think what the Conservatives have struggled to engage with is that despite the kind of external factors that Peter mentions, that's still probably the best political pitch for the Conservatives to have. Slightly more.
But how do you convert that pitch into policies? I mean, Johnson didn't succeed in sort of, laying out and pursuing a coherent set of policies. He had a pitch, yes. It's the one I think I described. But
well, I actually would turn to the Levelling Up white paper, which is about 900 pages
went
long.
Nowhere.
No, exactly, it went
Good
nowhere.
white paper went nowhere.
But that's not the point, though. The point is, it is a very coherent political and policy pitch grounded in evidence and pragmatism.
Yeah, I agree with
crafted
that.
by Michael Gove. But you're right, they didn't do anything. But that's not the same as saying there's no way to translate the pitch into policy.
Agree.
It's that they just didn't do it because A, they got distracted, and B, because
of
the
chaos.
next lot are in fact not in favour of that stuff. They're still lost in this sense of because Boris Johnson's agenda
so what
fell.
are they in favour of?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
No, but I don't.
All the
asking
many
wrong
things we
person.
can hold Polly
Danny,
accountable for,
come on.
not that.
What are they in favour of?
I'm not going to do that because that's divert us from the conversation we're having into a long conversation about Tory manifesto.
You can tell me after.
But I agree with Polly. I don't actually think. I think they did know roughly where they were going. There was a lot of dispute about whether it was the right direction or not, mainly because Boris Johnson was also opposed to the consequences of his own position. So we've got a very good example of this with the row about immigration. Everyone starts having a massive row about how there's too much immigration. The government does something about it. Everyone then complains that means there won't be enough. Right? So Boris Johnson was opposed to some of the consequences of his own policy. So, for example, he was in favour of big expenditure on infrastructure, expanding social spending and social responsibilities to things like social care, but also against putting up any of the taxes necessary to pay for it. So this ended up being a dispute with Rishi Sunak, mainly about whether or not you could be that fiscally irresponsible. You asked the question, Peter, could he oppose Boris Johnson more explicitly? And the answer is, I think he's already paying the price for the fact that he's distanced himself from Boris Johnson. He may as well get the benefit from it. He's not, in other words, he's already opposed
paying the price inside his own party.
Inside the Conservative Party, any price that Rishi Sunak will ever pay for not being Boris Johnson, for opposing Boris Johnson, for bringing Boris Johnson down, he's paying that already.
But he's ended up in the no man's land.
Correct, that's exactly what I'm saying. So what he's not doing is taking advantage of that. So he absolutely can, because he already is bearing the political costs of distancing himself from Boris Johnson. And my question to him would be, well, if you're already paying the price, why don't you get the benefit from it in terms of a public argument? Because every public argument you try, the route runs through saying, we're not going to run the government in the same way. It's not so much that you're distancing yourself from him politically, although there were certain issues on kind of rule of law issues.
Basically, Danny, you're saying that what Sunak's got to do is do a Starmer. What Starmer has done to Corbyn, he's got to do to Johnson.
Yes,
he's got to disavow him, repudiate him, perhaps not cut him off completely at the knees, and disqualify him from standing at the next election, which is an extreme, mould-breaking approach by Keir Starmer to his predecessor.
Is it too much?
No, it's not too much. It's necessary, inevitable, and exactly what the public demands. And what's interesting about it is that the party hasn't risen up in revolt against it.
But there's still not that simple, though, because what is he going to repudiate about Boris Johnson? The idea of governing like a sort of bear in a tea shop, he can repudiate that. But the central proposition was actually well structured to bring together the coalition that won Boris Johnson the 2019 election.
So it's Johnsonism without Johnson.
Exactly. So if he's going to distance himself from that more sort of centrist high spending agenda, he can do that, but that in fact plays to the more extreme wing of the Conservative Party. And so that's doing exactly what Danny advised him not to do last week, which is to tack towards what might win you the election. He needs Johnson without Johnson.
But he can just make that argument. And what I'm saying is, I think actually, relatively speaking, it's relatively easy. Boris Johnson, in fact, has also been removed from Parliament in the same way that has happened to Starmer and Corbyn. And Starmer took his time over this. The first shadow cabinet he appointed was designed to obscure all political choices, to appoint people who had no trace of politics that you could tell in the background in the Labour Party.
And then there's a little sweeping down.
And then about halfway through, it's a caricature a bit, but I think it's reasonable.
You're exaggerating to make a point.
Exactly.
Yes.
Halfway through this, how does one cope with this?
I know,
For goodness sake?
exhausting.
No, come to the end.
I've begun to become sympathetic to Gordon
yeah.
Brown over this.
He's had a double dose of granola this morning, I think.
It's enough to drive one bananas. But anyway.
Bananas and a small pot of yogurt.
About halfway through the
yogurt.
Parliament, he did then.
Then he made a choice. Just because we're talking about Keir Starmer and Tory leaders, is he right to say he admires Margaret Thatcher, Peter?
Of course, he's right to say that she was a strong prime minister who had a vision for the country. At one stage, a fairly well worked out plan and some changes that would, in her view, benefit the country. Why shouldn't he say that? I mean, what he wants to...
but was it a bit... So we were discussing this yesterday. Is it a bit try-hard, writing an I Love Margaret Thatcher piece in the Sunday Telegraph?
It wasn't an I Love Margaret Thatcher. It was saying, this is the sort of prime minister that the country needs. I mean, that's why he's associated himself with Blair, with Attlee, to an extent Wilson. These were sort of modernising prime ministers with a vision and a plan. You can argue as to what extent each of them fulfilled their plan and realised their vision, but they were modernising prime ministers and they were also election-winning leaders as a result. Now, that's why Starmer has embraced Attlee, Wilson and Blair. And when it comes to Thatcher, he's not sort of embracing her philosophy. He's not endorsing all her policies. I mean, that is a matter for debate. I happen to think that some of the things that she did in relation to the economy were timely and necessary. I think she also was oblivious to and indifferent to many of the social consequences of her economic policies. Now, that's my view. That's not necessarily Keir Starmer's view. But to say what sort of prime minister he's going to be, I think is very good. And incidentally, it's why Gordon Brown invited Margaret Thatcher into number 10. A slightly sort of awkward visit that Mrs. T paid to Gordon.
Were you there?
I wasn't there, no, but I sort of followed it acutely on television, and I felt acutely embarrassed by it because both of them looked equally sort of awkward during the whole thing. And it's why Ed Milliband also said, "Oh, I want to be like Mrs. Thatcher." Of course, what Ed Milliband wanted to do was to do on the left what Mrs. Thatcher had done on the right. Ed Milliband once explained this to me. He wanted to sort of, from the left, draw the centre ground of British politics onto his and the Labour Party's territory in the way that he believed Mrs. Thatcher had done for the right. And he told me, I want to be the Mrs. Thatcher of the left.
My critique of Keir Starmer's article was that it was an article in which he said he'd like to be like somebody who had a vision, rather than actually saying what, which wouldn't we all, right? And I think rather than actually set out what it was.
And it's all out of the Tony Blair playbook, isn't it? When you were in 1994, Tony Blair told The Times it was the clear sense of an identifiable project for the Tory party that I did admire. It is absolutely essential in politics. That is what keeps you going.
Matt, this goes back to the discussion we had last week about leading, deciding and dividing.
Yeah.
We were talking about how you deal with dissent in your party. You only encounter people who dissent when you give a clear lead, when you decide and take your party and the country, with clarity and purpose in a direction. That is what Mrs. Thatcher did. Like it or loathe it, that is what she did. And I think that Starmer is right to say that that's the style or model of leadership he wants to adopt as well.
Let's turn our attention now to some of the when you've had to deal with, when you've been advising a leader and they've been dealing with their predecessors. We've just talking about Margaret Thatcher, who obviously sort of plagued John Major, who you advised, Danny, and then William Hague, who you also advised. Here she is on the campaign trail in 2001.
Isn't the problem, Lady Thatcher, that William Hague isn't really up to the job?
William Hague is excellent. If you want to look at some people that aren't up to the job, you look elsewhere.
There we are. Danny, how did you get on with because John Major, obviously, she wasn't hugely helpful to him at times, and then, it was obviously still around then when you were advising William Hague.
Okay, it was very difficult because we'd actually lost, obviously, in this huge landslide, and the Conservative Party did have to change in lots of different ways. Both it had to, in my view, it had to sort of move towards where the electorate was, but there was also a big party handling issue on Europe. And every time you made a change and you wanted to say, we're different, therefore we're not the party but lost the last election with something else, you were obviously offending either Margaret Thatcher or you were offending John Major. And then we also had Ted Heath, actually, as well. And there was a terrible occasion when they both turned up to the party conference. Thatcher
and Heath?
Yeah, and it was the problem with it also then was you had these big figures, both, who'd been Prime Minister, and the leader of the opposition had not been. So you also were in danger of being overshadowed and letting them set the agenda. It was quite a hard problem to solve for some time. And actually, it's not surprising that the Conservative Party only managed to begin to move on when the leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, didn't actually have to refer back to any previous leaders because he was sort of from a next generation. And I think that's probably also true with Tony Blair, Peter will say.
No, I think that's true in a sense, but what Tony did, he didn't sort of simply distance himself from his immediate predecessor. He sort of, broadly speaking, excommunicated every previous leader of the Labour Party from his wholesale modernising project. I mean, what he said at the time was that the problem with the Labour Party was that it spent all its time negotiating with its past. And he wanted to end that. He wanted to represent something that was completely different in the Labour Party. He was certainly very strongly believed in the Labour Party as a party of conscience. I mean, its values, the way in which the Labour Party is, central to its whole sort of ethos and being is standing up for the poor and disadvantaged, the dispossessed in society. But it also, in Tony's view, had to be a reforming party. And because of our history, because of our roots, because of our trade union origins, he felt that we were completely hampered. Sort of every leader was cramped in his or her style by this history. And he was going to sort of uproot this history. Now, that actually gave me a bit of a problem. I mean, I was...
Because you were part of that history.
Well, my whole upbringing was sort of belonged. I mean, my grandfather was a member of both of Ramsay MacDonald's cabinet and Clement Attlee's. He was Clement Attlee's deputy. We were Wilson people, in my family, in my upbringing. And my first job in the Labour Party was working for Neil Kinnock as his communications director. So I sort of felt slightly uneasy about this sort of mass excommunication by Blair. But I could see the point he was making, and to demonstrate to the public that this really was something new and different, he had, in a sense, to exaggerate to make a point. And I mean, Tony's view of leaders of the Labour Party, his predecessors, they were either old-fashioned Labour, who didn't stand a chance of winning an election, sort of Foot and sort of obviously latterly Corbyn, or they were plain Labour, who would benefit from the unpopularity of the Tories and could win an election once, but not necessarily again, or they were modern Labour. I mean, people who were really committed to reforming and overhauling the country. And he put himself, obviously, very much in the third category. I don't think that we have seen a leader since Blair who has so obviously or consciously put themselves in the modernising bracket until Starmer. I think Starmer does see himself in that way. He may not have thought it through fully or may not have sketched out every sort of last sort of dot and comma and cross the T's, etc. But there has been no leader since Blair up until Starmer who has seen themselves in that modernising mould. They've seen themselves either as plain Labour or old-fashioned Labour, and I think that's why we've lost.
Polly, the Lib Dems who you work for have a sort of slightly different because they don't have quite the same history as a newer party, but as a result you've had, Paddy Ashdown and then Charles Kennedy, who you first worked for, sort of their their reputation. I mean, some people might even think they're still leaders of the Lib Dems. You know, their personal reputation hanging over the people who've come since. Is it more personality than policy?
It's certainly true that for Nick Clegg, for Tim Farron, for Ed Davey, they will always be presented with this light, but you're not as famous and well-loved as Paddy Ashdown or Charles Kennedy. And none of them got to go and present Have I Got News for You? And you know, weren't quite that guy. So it's always an expectation. But when you're a third party, you're fighting so hard for attention anyway that, frankly, anything the media can do to just blame you for the fact that you're not in the media, they just do. They love it. But it's interesting that, you know, these conversations are happening at two levels, right? You're talking about the inside Westminster version of this. How do you deal with the residue, I guess, of the tribal loyalties and the affections and the rivalries that are still part of your activist community, maybe your parliamentary party, but also that the wider community. But then you're also thinking about how are you communicating to the public? Peter was talking about essentially irritating the party as a way of communicating a modernisation to the public at large. And in a way, I think that's what Starmer was doing with the article about Thatcher, is partly he's trying to communicate to the public rather than navigate the complexities of his internal party politics. When it comes to the internal party politics, I think what you want to get to is the ability to be as generous as you can, even about your rivals, if you want to hold your party together. We endlessly trolled through Charles Kennedy quotes and Joe Grimmond quotes. Joe Grimmond was the leader of the Liberal Party in, I don't know, some past before I was born. To make people feel like you understand and are connected to the heritage that they care about. But, you know, that loyalty was really important, especially in a third party, because what you need is to mobilise your activists. I think very often it's a different thing that you need.
Joe Grimmond was leader until 1966, at which point, at least
I knew he'd know.
Peter and I did not have this problem, which is we may have had Neil Kinnock in your case or Ted Heath in my case, but neither of us ever had to cope with the problem of Jeremy Thorpe turning up to our conference and having to explain that we'd probably moved on from conspiracy to frighten people. So that is like a problem of a completely different order. When you have a leader like that,
but even I was just want to ask Polly, but like the question of going into coalition,
yeah.
Because they were, you know, the number of well-known Lib Dems, yeah, actually having Paddy Ashdown, Ming Campbell, Charles Kennedy on board was probably seen as more important than a lot of your MPs who bluntly, the public and half the lobby didn't know who they were.
Well, whose fault is that, Matt?
Well, I did my best to bring attention to Annette Brooke and Dan Rogerson, but it probably wasn't enough.
Ricky Younger-Ross?
Richard Younger-Ross, of course, they're all there. Andrew George.
But
the rest of the podcast could just be naming former Lib Dem MPs.
Actually, you wouldn't, because we've got 16 minutes to go.
I got my job at the Liberal Democrats. There was like a quiz to see if you were a real Liberal Democrat, and you had to name Liberal Democrat MPs other than Charles Kennedy, Lembit Opic, and so I just Googled it. And because I didn't know of any. Anyway, so I tricked.
It doesn't sound like a very good quiz if you could Google it while you were doing it.
Well, no, it wasn't very well designed. But hey, I figured, I'm being employed as a researcher. I need to be able to do some research. They gave me the job, but that's obviously because I'm totally brilliant or something. Anyway, back to the point. Absolutely. And again, it is partly about communicating to your activists. You know, those were people who loved Paddy Ashdown, and they were people who loved Charles Kennedy, because those were charismatic leaders who had been on the doorsteps with them. And if you're trying to hold people together, you want to feel like this is something that the whole team is on board with. If you are endlessly picking apart rivalries and resentment within your party, you're not focused on the voters. But also voters tend to get quite annoyed with that sort of inside Westminster bickering.
And then what do you do when someone does decide to try and, you know, torch the past and distance yourself? Let's go back to 2010. This is Ed Milliband in his first party conference speech.
You saw jobs disappear and economic security undermined. And I understand your anger at a Labour government that claimed it could end boom and bust. And I understand also that the promise of new politics of 1997 came to look incredibly hollow after the scandal of MPs' expenses. And we came to look like a new establishment in the company we kept, the style of our politics, and our remoteness from people.
You look almost wistful there, Polly.
No, it's excruciating. Why
Come
on
on, let's be fair to
earth
Ed.
would you
Let's
do
be-
that to your
Let's
side?
be fair to Ed Milliband. I mean, he woke up one day and it suddenly dawned on him that he knew why New Labour had been so unsuccessful, why it had failed to win all these elections with these huge majorities, why even under the onslaught, the Tory onslaught in 2005 and the fracturing of our coalition over Iraq, we were still able to come back with a majority of nearly 70. And it occurred to him that he had a completely different and much better idea about how to win elections than anyone who had preceded him. And
Can I try to be genuinely fair to you? Okay, you had so this is it's a harder problem than you're both letting on, right? In 2010, Labour had lost the election, so he did actually have to provide the public with the idea we've listened to the electorate. In that last election, we've changed. I mean, part of his problem, of course, was that I think he had encouraged Labour down the route that helped them lose the election, and therefore what he was actually asking for was to go further down that route, right? So, for example,
because he was in the cabinet that fought that election,
so
I was a close ally of Gordon
but
Brown.
I mean,
lost it.
David Milliband was also, after all, planning in his conference speech to say we made big mistakes and to sort of take a fall on the deficit issue, which is a very controversial position. Even years later, people said Labour made too many concessions to George Osborne on the deficit and shouldn't have done that. So, to be fair to him, he was trying to solve and that was exactly what I was referring to with William Hague earlier. It's a difficult problem. If you fought an election on a manifesto that you believe in, and you've been defeated solidly, and you then have to say we've listened to that and we're going to change, and yet obviously you probably think you were right and the electorate wasn't. What do you do in those circumstances?
Danny, the only way in which we were going to win the 2010 election and defeat Cameron and Osborne and what they were planning to do to the economy and austerity and the savage cuts was by acknowledging that the deficit was large and our indebtedness of necessity following the global financial crisis was too great, and that over time we had to take measures to stabilise our fiscal situation. That's what we needed to do. And if we had done that properly, full-throatedly, and said, look, this is the challenge that the country faces. This is what we've gone through with the financial crisis. This is what we had to do to stop the rest of the economy following our banks over a cliff. These are all the measures that we've taken to stave off, depression in our economy. But now we are out of this. We are on an slowly upward curve, and we are going to start rectifying our financial situation. Would Gordon Brown do that? No, he wouldn't, because he saw that as too great a concession to Cameron and Osborne.
They
And
think
that's
we're in the
why
Lords, Polly.
that's why we were in the
That's why
we were in the muddle. That's why we were in the muddle in our election in 2010 that we were.
Let's zoom out for a moment, right? So on my very first day working in politics in 2004, my boss, a guy called Rob Blackie, gave me a sort of lecture on how he saw what was wrong with politics. And he said, the airline industry will compete with each other really aggressively, but they would never compete on the basis of our aeroplane is safer, because as soon as you start people thinking about safety, you actually hurt the whole industry and everyone stops wanting to fly. And the problem with politics is we never take that kind of self-denying ordinance. We are always willing to take the short-term benefit of attacking the other party or the other people within our party, and we just absolutely destroy the brand of politics. And when we do it to our party, we destroy the brands of our party. And that is what Ed Miliband did, and what the Liberal Democrats
did post-coalition.
Absolutely. And that's probably one of the reasons why it infuriates me, because it's arrogance, right? It's absolute arrogance to imagine that somebody else is going to tell the positive story about the good things you did for you. And for Ed Miliband to just say, that everything Labour had done was wrong is mindless. For the Liberal Democrats to say that the coalition was completely wrong. Of course it had faults. Yes, you need to show that you're listening. Yes, you show that you're changing, but you choose a strategic position to take thoughtfully, and you remember that it is your job to tell the story of what your party
Especially
thinks.
when what he was proposing to put in place of New Labour was a sort of mushy, reheated old Labour.
But I'm saying, I agree.
Appeal to nobody.
I agree with you. I mean, I think Polly's completely right. But what you're both arguing, and I agree with it actually, is that what he should have advanced is a different critique of effectively New Labour, if you assume that's what Gordon Brown was. You know, you would still be up there making a speech in which you were saying we have made mistakes. You cannot lose an election, particularly like 1997, and go back to the party conference and say, I think it's you, the electorate, that's made a mistake, and you'll kind of wake up to this in a while. So you're going to have some criticism.
To be fair,
but it was the wrong criticism. That's
to be
the
fair
problem
to
there,
Ed Milliband, you could argue
This is your new catchphrase.
for a nanosecond. You could say that the confusion started with Gordon after he succeeded Tony.
Weren't you in the cabinet then?
Essentially, I
You
came
were
back.
advising him then.
Thank you very much. But I was never able to resolve in Gordon's mind whether, you know, he was continuity New Labour or change from New Labour. Gordon could never resolve this in his head. Intellectually, he was New Labour. But the problem was that he saw New Labour more as a sort of an election-winning narrative than a political philosophy with which to govern and run the country.
Here's my alternative theory. It is Tony Blair that abandoned New Labour. Gordon Brown stayed absolutely completely solid to the vision of Bill Clinton and Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and the Progressive Policy Institute and the New Democrats from the middle of the 1990s, from 1994. Tony Blair got impatient with that, didn't think it was going far enough, wanted more marketisation, wanted to control public spending. He wanted to go beyond New Labour, and in fact, in some way, and was that also true with Iraq?
He wanted to lead a party of conscience and reform, and unfortunately, every single reform that came along, Gordon wasn't keen on.
Exactly.